The rumble of the lawnmower was usually a sound of satisfaction, a sign of a weekend accomplished. But today, it felt like a prelude to a disaster I knew was coming. Lucy Bunting. Just the name tasted like bile in my mouth. She'd been a thorn in my side ever since I bought the house next to hers 3 years ago. It started with subtle microaggressions, complaining about my music being too loud, even when it wasn't playing, questioning my parking choices, and generally treating me like I was some kind of unwelcome invader in her pristine, predominantly white neighborhood. It escalated over time. Snide remarks about my kind not belonging here, thinly veiled accusations of property value devaluation, and a constant, palpable air of disdain that followed me like a shadow. I tried to ignore her. I really did. I focused on fixing up my house, making it a home. I planted a beautiful garden, filled with vibrant flowers and a vegetable patch that was the envy of some of my other neighbors. I worked hard, paid my taxes, and tried to be a contributing member of the community. But Lucy wouldn't let me. She saw me, not as Josh Carter, homeowner, but as a black man daring to occupy space she believed was not meant for me. The constant barrage of negativity was exhausting, but I refused to let her win. I refused to be driven out of my home. So, I mowed my lawn. Every Saturday morning, I'd get out there, the rhythmic whir of the engine a small act of defiance against her silent judgment. This particular Saturday, the sun was beating down, making the grass thick and unruly. I was halfway through when I heard it, that shrill, piercing voice that could curdle milk. "You! Stop that racket!" I sighed, cutting the engine. I knew this was coming. I turned to face her, bracing myself for the inevitable onslaught of racist vitriol. She stood on her meticulously manicured lawn, hands on her hips, her face contorted in a mask of disgust. "I swear, you people have no consideration. Can't you see it's too early for this noise? And look at you, disrupting the peace of this neighborhood." I took a deep breath. "Lucy, it's after 10 in the morning. It's a perfectly reasonable time to mow the lawn. Don't you get smart with me," she screeched, her voice rising in pitch. "I'm calling the police. You're disturbing the peace, and frankly, I don't even think you own this house. Probably squatting here, bringing down the whole neighborhood." The casual racism stung, but I refused to show it. "Go ahead and call the police, Lucy. I'm legally mowing my lawn, on my property." I restarted the mower, the loud engine a shield against her hateful words. I watched as she fumbled for her phone, her face a twisted caricature of righteous indignation. I knew she would call. I just didn't expect what would happen next. I tried to ignore Lucy as I continued mowing. I focused on the neat lines I was creating, the satisfying scent of freshly cut grass. But her words kept echoing in my head, each slur a tiny barb digging into my soul. I knew she was on the phone, her voice rising and falling in dramatic waves as she spun her web of lies for the 911 operator. I could hear fragments of her conversation, disturbing the peace, menacing, doesn't belong here. It was all painfully predictable. Within minutes, a police car pulled up to the curb. My heart sank. I recognized the officer immediately, Officer Miller. He'd been out here a few times before, usually in response to Lucy's petty complaints. Each time, he'd given me a look that was a mix of suspicion and thinly veiled contempt. He was one of those good old boys who seemed to automatically side with Lucy, regardless of the facts. I cut the engine again as Officer Miller approached, his hand resting on his holster. Lucy, now emboldened by the arrival of law enforcement, stepped forward, pointing at me with a trembling finger. "Officer, this man is harassing me. He's been making excessive noise all morning, and he's been making threats. I fear for my safety." I wanted to laugh, but the situation was too serious. "That's a lie, officer," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and even. "I'm simply mowing my lawn. I haven't threatened anyone." Officer Miller ignored me, his eyes fixed on Lucy. Are you all right, Mrs. Bunting? Has he physically harmed you in any way? Not yet, Lucy said, her voice dripping with melodrama. But I feel threatened. I'm sure he's going to do something, especially since his kind are always causing trouble. My blood boiled. Officer, this is ridiculous. This is harassment. She's calling the police on me for mowing my lawn because I'm black. Officer Miller finally turned his gaze to me, his eyes cold and hard. Watch your tone, Carter, he said, his voice laced with warning. Mrs. Bunting is a respected member of this community. You need to show her some respect. Respect? I scoffed. She's been harassing me since I moved in. She's a racist who can't stand the fact that a black man lives next door to her. Officer Miller took a step closer to me, his face inches from mine. I'm going to give you one chance to calm down, Carter. Otherwise, I'm going to have to take you in for disturbing the peace and making false accusations. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. He was taking her side, completely ignoring the fact that she was the one who was harassing me. You're not going to do anything, I said, trying to stand my ground. I haven't broken any laws. She's the one who's out of line. He just smirked. We'll see about that. Before I could react, Officer Miller grabbed my arm, twisting it behind my back. The pain shot through my shoulder, and I cried out in protest. What are you doing? You can't arrest me for this. He ignored my pleas, tightening his grip as he forced my hands behind my back. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into my wrists. You're under arrest for disturbing the peace, resisting arrest, and making false accusations, he announced, his voice devoid of any empathy. Lucy stood there, a smug look on her face, watching as I was being led away in handcuffs. The humiliation was overwhelming. I was being arrested in my own yard, in front of my neighbors, all because a racist woman couldn't stand the sight of me. I looked around, hoping to see some sign of support, some indication that someone recognized the injustice of the situation. But most of my neighbors were inside their houses, peering out from behind closed curtains. I couldn't blame them, but their silence felt like a betrayal. As Officer Miller led me to the police car, I felt a surge of anger and helplessness. How could this be happening in America? How could a police officer so blatantly abuse his power based on race and prejudice? I knew I was being targeted, not because I had committed any crime, but simply because of the color of my skin. The ride to the police station was a blur. I sat in the back of the car, seething with rage and frustration. Officer Miller didn't say a word, his silence a tacit acknowledgement of the injustice he was perpetrating. At the station, I was booked and processed, treated like a common criminal. My mugshot was taken, my fingerprints were scanned, and I was thrown into a holding cell. The cell was small and cramped, with a dirty concrete floor and a single metal bench. The air was thick with the smell of stale sweat and despair. I sat on the bench, trying to make sense of what had happened. I couldn't believe that Lucy had gotten away with it. She had lied to the police, manipulated the situation, and used her privilege to have me arrested. And Officer Miller, a sworn officer of the law, had willingly participated in her racist scheme. It was a sickening display of prejudice and abuse of power. I knew I had to fight back. I couldn't let them get away with this. Sitting in that stark cell, I felt utterly alone. The clanging doors and distant shouts of other inmates only amplified my sense of isolation. I needed help, and fast. I knew I couldn't rely on the local justice system, not when it was so clearly stacked against me. My thoughts raced, trying to find a solution, a lifeline in this sea of despair. Then, it hit me. Maria. Maria Rodriguez was a paralegal at a small, but fiercely dedicated civil rights law firm downtown. We'd met at a community meeting last year, and she'd given me her card, saying to reach out if I ever needed legal assistance. At the time, I'd brushed it off, thinking I'd never need it. Now, that card was my only hope. I banged on the cell door, shouting for a guard. After what felt like an eternity, a bored-looking officer sauntered over. "What do you want, Carter?" "I need to make a phone call," I said, my voice hoarse. "I have the right to a phone call." The officer sighed, clearly annoyed. All right. Just one." He led me to a grimy payphone in the hallway. I fumbled in my pocket for Maria's card, my hands shaking with anxiety. I dialed the number, praying she'd answer. Each ring felt like an eternity. Finally, she picked up. "Rodriguez and Associates," Maria speaking. "Maria, it's Josh Carter. We met at the community meeting last year. I need your help." My voice cracked with emotion. I quickly explained the situation, from Lucy's constant harassment to Officer Miller's blatant abuse of power. Maria listened intently, her voice growing increasingly concerned. "That's outrageous, Josh," she said. "I can't believe they arrested you for that. I'm going to get right on this. Give me the name of the jail and your booking number. I'll try to get you released as soon as possible." I gave her the information, my heart pounding with relief. "Thank you, Maria," I said, my voice filled with gratitude. "You're my only hope." "Don't worry, Josh," she said. "We're going to fight this. We're going to expose what's happening. This isn't right, and we're not going to let them get away with it." After the call, I felt a flicker of hope ignite within me. Maria was a fighter. She wouldn't back down. She'd seen injustice before, and she knew how to combat it. I returned to the cell, feeling a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since the incident. I knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but I was no longer alone. I had Maria on my side, and that gave me the strength to face whatever came next. I started planning my defense, trying to remember every detail of the incident, every word that was spoken, every action that was taken. I knew I had to be prepared to tell my story, to expose the truth, to fight for my freedom and my dignity. Maria was a whirlwind of action. Within hours, she filed a motion for my immediate release, citing the lack of probable cause for my arrest and the clear evidence of racial bias. She contacted the local media, alerting them to the story of the black man arrested for mowing his lawn, thanks to a racist neighbor and a complicit police officer. The story quickly went viral. News outlets picked it up, and social media exploded with outrage. People were sharing my mugshot, along with the details of the incident, using hashtags like #JusticeForJosh and #RacismInOurTown. The pressure on the police department was immense. They couldn't ignore the public outcry. An internal investigation was launched, focusing on Officer Miller's actions and Lucy Bunting's history of complaints against me. The truth began to surface. Other neighbors came forward, corroborating my story. They testified to Lucy's racist behavior, her constant harassment, and her habit of calling the police on me for petty grievances. They described how she would glare at me when I walked down the street, how she would make snide remarks about my property, and how she would constantly complain about my presence in the neighborhood. The investigation also uncovered Officer Miller's own history of misconduct. There were allegations of racial profiling, excessive force, and a pattern of siding with white residents over black residents in disputes. It turned out that he and Lucy Bunting were more than just casual acquaintances. They were members of the same exclusive country club, and they had a long-standing friendship. The evidence was damning. It was clear that Officer Miller had abused his power to protect his friend and to punish me for being black. The judge reviewed Maria's motion and the evidence presented by the investigation. He was appalled by what he saw. He immediately ordered my release, dismissing all charges against me. He also issued a scathing rebuke to the police department, condemning their failure to protect me from harassment and their complicity in the racist actions of Officer Miller and Lucy Bunting. When I walked out of the jail, Maria was there waiting for me. She hugged me tightly, her eyes filled with tears of joy. "You're free, Josh," she said. "We did it." As we walked to her car, I saw a crowd of people gathered outside the jail, holding signs and chanting my name. They were my neighbors, my friends, and complete strangers who had been moved by my story. They had come to show their support, to celebrate my freedom, and to demand justice. I felt a wave of gratitude wash over me. I was no longer alone. I had a community behind me, and together, we were going to fight for a better future. The arrest had shaken me, but the outpouring of support and the ensuing legal battles had steeled my resolve. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for every black man and woman who had ever been unfairly targeted by the police, for every person who had ever been judged based on the color of their skin. Lucy Bunting and Officer Miller were eventually arrested. Lucy was charged with filing a false police report, harassment, and hate crimes. Officer Miller was charged with abuse of power, false arrest, and obstruction of justice. Their trial was a media circus. The courtroom was packed with reporters, activists, and community members who wanted to witness justice being served. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence, including the testimony of my neighbors, the police department's internal investigation, and Officer Miller's own incriminating statements. Lucy Bunting tried to portray herself as the victim, claiming that I had been harassing her and that she had simply been trying to protect her property. But her lies were quickly exposed. The prosecutor presented evidence of her racist history, her pattern of harassing black residents, and her close relationship with Officer Miller. Officer Miller, on the other hand, tried to deny any wrongdoing. He claimed that he had simply been doing his job and that he had no idea that Lucy Bunting was a racist. But his excuses fell flat. The prosecutor presented evidence of his racial profiling, his excessive use of force, and his blatant disregard for the rights of black citizens. The jury deliberated for days. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Finally, they reached a verdict. Lucy Bunting was found guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to several years in prison and a hefty fine. Officer Miller was also found guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to an even longer prison term and was stripped of his badge. The courtroom erupted in cheers. People were crying, hugging, and celebrating the victory. Justice had finally been served. After the trial, I decided to file a civil lawsuit against Lucy Bunting, Officer Miller, and the police department. I wanted to hold them accountable for their actions and to send a message that racism and abuse of power would not be tolerated. The lawsuit attracted even more attention. It became a symbol of the fight for racial justice and police accountability. The case was eventually settled out of court. Lucy Bunting and Officer Miller were forced to pay me a substantial sum of money, and the police department agreed to implement new policies to prevent racial profiling and abuse of power. With the money from the settlement, I started a foundation to support victims of racial discrimination and police brutality. I wanted to use my experience to help others who had been through similar situations. I traveled the country, speaking at rallies, protests, and community events. I shared my story, advocating for change, and inspiring others to stand up for justice. I became a symbol of hope for many who had felt marginalized and oppressed. Life wasn't easy. There were still moments of doubt and fear. But I refused to be silenced. I refused to let Lucy Bunting and Officer Miller break me. I was determined to use my experience to make a difference in the world, to create a more just and equitable society for all. I continued to live in my house, mowing my lawn every Saturday morning. But now, when I heard the rumble of the engine, I knew it wasn't just a sound of satisfaction. It was a sound of freedom, of resilience, and of hope. It was a reminder that even in the face of injustice, we can overcome, we can fight for what's right, and we can create a better future for ourselves and for generations to come. The scars of that day remained, but they served as a reminder of the battles won and the work that still needed to be done. My lawn, once a symbol of contention, now stood as a testament to the enduring power of justice and the unwavering spirit of a community united against hate.